Good afternoon. The February 17th meeting of the Oklahoma City Water Utilities Trust will be in order. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from February 3rd.
Move approval. Second.
Motion and a second to approve the minutes. Are there comments, questions? Voting, please. Minutes are approved. Next item is the consent docket.
Move approval subject to individual consideration.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve the consent docket. Are there matters to be considered individually?
Mr. Chairman, I have a sort of a general question. Items A and B have to do with some improvements at the Hefner Water Treatment Plant. And when are we going to get through with that project? I've had some calls about the construction containers that are around there, and it just looks like a construction site.
It does, and some of those things are stored items that the plant personnel are using. We're going to be reformulating, moving things away, putting things away. We have a lot of construction yet to come at Hefner. Obviously, the chemical building will make a big impact on the site in a good way, and allow things to look a little more organized. Things will go inside the building that used to be outside. But containers are going to last for a while, and I'll get you some more specific information about that.
I appreciate that.
Any other items? I have a question about item C. Do we have a report on, other than what's contained here, about the success or failure of the previous attempts to revegetate the shoreline?
Yes, sir, and I'll get that for you and either send you a copy or bring it back next time if it hasn't been presented previously. I think the issue is it's been quite a while since we talked with Odeberby about their work at Lake Draper. The planting work has done very well for us. We're really pleased with the shoreline impacts that it's having. We need to do some more, and we need to catch up with plants that were damaged because the lake level dropped so low in the 2011 timeframe. So this work will begin another 3-year process where we work with Odeberby at a very modest cost to help reduce erosion along the lake shoreline. And we'll bring you the previous report.
Okay. Any other comments or questions on the consent docket? Voting, please. Consent docket's approved. Next item is a concurrence docket. One item.
Move the concurrence docket.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve the concurrence docket. Are there questions or comments? Concurrence docket's approved. Next item, items for individual consideration. A presentation concerning one of these days we'll be able to say municipalization without having to think about it. About the Tinker Air Force Base municipal project.
Bob, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks. I'm Bob Woodhouse with MWH. I'm here with our partners in Guernsey, Sue Haas and Jared. We're going to have a kind of a joint presentation today. I'll start talking about our overall technical approach, and then Jared will fill in some of the details on our approach to the pricing. Next slide. So this chart indicates where we are in the overall process. We're nearing the end of the procurement phase. You can see we added a box there, contract negotiations. That's where we're working towards to get there with the government to negotiate the deal, probably in August time frame of this year. But we've completed what we call the final draft technical and pricing proposals. And now we'd like to talk about the approach we had to the technical proposals. So this is the final meeting, really, with the trust to present to you our approach on the technical proposal. And it's taking place in February. The next milestone, as you see there, will be to submit the proposal documents to the government on March 15th is the date that they're due. Next. Let's keep in mind the overall objectives of the project is to minimize the number of new full-time employees, required to operate and maintain the Tinker Air Force Base systems. Number 2 is to make sure there is no significant impact of the Tinker acquisition on existing ratepayers. Number 3, very important, to retain Tinker Air Force Base as a strong employer and a key economic engine of the community. So those are the 3 objectives or guiding principles. Next. So the documents we're preparing, we'll prepare 2 base proposal documents, one for the water system that will make use of the existing wells out there and supply Tinker with groundwater, and we'll continue to operate those for the 23 wells for the 50-year period. Then for the wastewater system, we decided that it'd be the best interest of the trust to eliminate most of the 50 sewer lift stations that are out there. There's a lot of lift stations out there that just serve one building, just the way they develop projects out at Tinker. They put in a barracks, and if they don't want to bring it over by gravity, just would stick in a lift station, send it over. So we're going to eliminate 45 of those 50 lift stations and construct a new interceptor to deliver the flow by gravity. And then we developed an alternate proposal which we felt would be a lower long-term cost to the government and would better use the resources that Aquid has to offer, and that is to supply Tinker Air Force Base with water from city water. And in doing so, we'd be able to eliminate, once again, most of the 23 existing groundwater wells. So those are the different proposals we're going to pull together and submit to the government. This chart indicates the significant capital improvement program that needs to take place during the first 10 to 15 years of the project. Most of the water and wastewater assets out there have reached their useful life. Also, the government indicated what they called initial system deficiency corrections, ISDCs. And those are indicated there with the yellow and like the dark blue or black bars in the initial years of the project, because we're required by the contract to address those issues within the first 5 years of the contract. At that point, we'll embark on a significant renewal and replacement program, replacing pipes shown in the lines shown in blue there are the water pipes and water infrastructure, and then the reddish lines are the sewer system improvements that need to replace the existing sewer pipes and so forth. At that point, after that first 15 years, you can see the R&R really drops off. And at that point, we're going to be in a real steady state place where we'll be able to have minimum amounts of capital and minimum amounts of disruption out of the post. At this point, I'd like to have Jared come and talk a couple slides about our approach to the pricing.
Thanks, Bob. As Bob said, I'm Jared Stiggy with Guernsey, and although I've been working with Bob on the technical items, my particular area of focus is price, and so that's what I'm here to talk about with you today. Some of this information you may recall from the last time I was here. We were also talking about pricing at that point. But just to cover it really briefly, the first 2 bullets reflect that the price we'll be proposing is a all-in cost to provide both the capital over capitalization that Bob was just talking about, and then the O&M and G&A required to operate the assets that are out at Tinker. The third bullet speaks to the fact that the pricing model that we'll be submitting is a regulated tariff cost of service type model, which means we are required to submit a proposed price, but that price is just that. It's a proposal based upon the information that the Air Force has provided us, which is somewhat scant, to be honest. It's about 2 years dated. We were afforded an opportunity to go out to the site and perform a visual inspection, but there's been no subsurface inspection, and so the amount of information that's provided is fairly limited to things like quantity, size, age, approximate age of installation. But other than that, there's not a lot of detail. So we've prepared a proposed price. That price will be evaluated against the government's proposed price based upon the same information, but the actual service will be provided in a cost of service type environment where We'll record costs, we'll accrue operations and G&A expense, and then on periodic rate redeterminations, we will look at what is the true cost to serve out at Tinker, and then go through a process the federal government has in place to revise those rates so that you're fully recovering the cost of service out there. The fourth bullet on that same slide refers to the same two tests that we talked about last time as well, which is that the government has to find that there's a fair market value being offered for the utility system, and that in the long term, the cost of water and wastewater utility service will be lower by going with Aquit than if the government were to continue operations on its own. I know that last time fair market value was something that was of interest to you. We heard that interest loud and clear, and we worked together with members of the staff to try to identify strategies to reduce the fair market value, and I think we've done a good job doing that in a way that will be supportable and at least acceptable to the government. We'll see how, during negotiations, how much they agree with that, but we have identified some strategies to make some improvements in that regard. Next slide is sort of covering some of the ground I've already talked about, that it will be a regulated tariff proposal, and that the prices we propose will set a level of expectation on the government, but does not bind us to stay within those prices based upon the fact that we have not been afforded full opportunity to investigate, characterize, and study the utility systems. And then the last bullet being that, again, that it's a cost of service tariff, and that we will follow the established processes that you already utilize to set rates for your existing ratepayers, to set rates for Tinker as well. The difference being that Tinker will essentially become a customer class of one for a unique rate that is charged only to Tinker, and the challenge will be on our side to actively segregate all our costs so that we can insulate those and then use those to form the cost of service that will be charged to Tinker. Moving on to the next slide, I talked a little bit about the fact that they will compare our proposal to their own government cost estimate. And the cost estimate they're using is not looking backwards at what they've spent historically, because they know that they have not adequately funded their utility system for years. They haven't adequately capitalized it, and they haven't adequately staffed it. So what they do is they create something they call their should cost estimate, which is given where they're at now, what should they spend over the coming 50 years to provide utility or industry-grade service to Tinker Air Force Base. And so they have hired a consultant to help them with those should costs. And then we know that typically what the consultants do is they use RS means to develop capital costs. They'll use an area cost factor that's published by the DOD that is public record, so we know what that is. But in general, they have retained a consultant that is helping them to develop that cost that they should be spending. And then what we have done for you is we have used our knowledge to develop what we are estimating could be that cost that their consultant has developed. There's no guarantee that we're going to hit it right on the head. In fact, I can guarantee you the number we have won't be the number they come up with. But the methodology that we've used is consistent with the methodology the government uses. And so it should be a fair measuring stick with which we can evaluate how economically attractive or unattractive our proposed price is going into negotiations. Last slide on pricing is just covering again the guiding principles that our team has been working under the whole time, which has been reinforced very well to us by your staff, which is that we've taken an approach based upon our past experience, understanding not just how these contracts are awarded, but how they are then implemented and managed by the government. There's certain pitfalls that contractors can step into, especially ones that aren't accustomed to working as federal contractors. And so we have worked to try to not oversell the trust, to not overpromise or overcommit. Our goal has been to state that we're going to provide essentially the same level of service that's provided outside the fence, except in those areas where the Air Force has unique requirements due to their defense mission or things like that. But for the most part, we are just trying to provide the same utility service that we do outside the fence. There are a large amount of capital improvements needed in the first years, And we have worked to try to identify strategies to minimize that impact to the government. Of course, as you saw from Bob's slide, the amount of capital that needs to be spent out there is significant. And rate shock, if you want to call it that, is something that's going to be an unavoidable outcome from that. But we are being upfront with the government and clearly identifying what those costs are going to be. We've worked to identify, one of the reasons the government is coming to entities like the trust is you have the ability to bond construction, and while the initial capital cost might not be any cheaper, you can at least spread that out over a longer period of time, and so we have done that. We've made sure to take advantage of the contract mechanisms that the federal government offers to make sure that prices are updated on a regular basis to reflect the cost of service. We are proposing, as I said, that regulated tariff model, which is one of the two models that's offered to offerers, the other being a fixed price with economic price adjustment, which is not really attractive because you're essentially pegging your costs to an economic index, and indices are generally not good for people on the service provision side. They're usually a good deal for the government. So we've made sure that we're proposing that cost of service tariff that is very similar to how you currently set rates. And the last bullet being that we're really hoping that what we've put together for the government is not just a win for the citizens of Oklahoma City, but also a win for Tinker Air Force Base, and that they really need, as you saw again from Bob's slide, a lot of capital investment out there, and they just can't get those funds like they used to be able to do that type of work. And so we're hoping it's going to be a good win for the ratepayers, a good win for Tinker, and a win for the contractors, local contractors that would be able to get to work performing a lot of upgrades out there once the contract gets awarded. That concludes my comments on pricing. I was going to sit back down, but if you have any questions about pricing at this point.
I have one. How soon would the first opportunity to revisit the contract price be?
All right,
Would it be a year, or would it be 2 years? I mean, it seems to me there are so many pitfalls in this that your job is extremely, almost impossible, really, to determine until we get in there and know how bad things really are with regard to the need to replace things. I'd be interested to know how soon we could revisit that if we miss the mark.
Sure. It would really be somewhat up to your discretion and your comfort level with when you felt like you had achieved a sufficient amount of financial information upon which you could base a rate determination. But in general, when the proposal is accepted by the government, it will have already built into it the first year's funding, and that will be a monthly rate that's fixed for the first 12 months. And that will include an amount for O&M and G&A and an amount for capital projects. And so typically what we see a utility do is during that first year, your proposal has set the amount of money that you're going to get from the government. And while you can seek requests for equitable adjustment or change orders based on scope, by and large, that sets your first year's worth of revenue that will be coming in. And so the challenge is kind of on you as the utility to manage within that budget as best you can. Honestly, what we typically see is contractors can often underspend in the first year. We are assuming that on day one we're going to have 100% full hiring and all positions staffed. What we typically see is maybe by the end of the first year, utilities are getting up to 100% staffing, but they're not quite there to begin with. So you'll have some things where you'll win like that. You'll have some things where you might need to end up spending more money than we proposed because, like I said, you haven't been out there to see the site. So I would say the first year is probably on your management to try to stay within that budget that we've set as much as possible. If you feel confident after the end of that first year that you have a sufficient amount of price data that you can intelligently set a new rate going forward, you know what your known and measurables are going to be for the next period, there would be nothing preventing you from doing that at the one-year anniversary. In addition to those major rate changes, like I said, there are provisions under the federal contract where you can come in for a change of scope if there's latent subsurface conditions, if there's a significant change in pricing based upon assumptions. There are opportunities to come in and request an adjustment from the government, but that's a contract process It does take some time, and it's outside, I think, what your typical comfort level would be, which would just be, accumulating your costs, setting a rate, and then charging that rate, and not dealing with a bunch of change orders to the federal government.
Thank you.
Other questions on pricing?
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Next, another guiding principle was to minimize the number of new Aqua employees to operate and maintain the systems. And there's really 3 ways that we're going to do that. First one is with capital improvements, SCADA systems to help automate the work out there. I gave the example of eliminating the lift stations. Well, they were investing capital to put in a new interceptor sewer so we can deliver the flow by gravity and take out all those lift stations and force main pipes. Second area is in consultant support during transition in the performance phases. One of the initial tasks there is to reach out to the local engineering, consulting community, and construction community and make them aware that this work is coming and start to collect their qualifications and develop a list of ones that they could be our go-to consultants for designing water pipes, sewer pipes, same with the contractors, because, there's a lot of other construction work going on, going to be planned here in Oklahoma City in the next 5 to 10 years. So we want to make sure that we're broadcasting and engaging the local consultant and construction community early on. There'll be additional services that MWH and Guernsey will be providing using our experience of having done this at other locations, other places where we've actually delivered the utility services to Air Force and Army bases. So we'll assist during transition, perform the system characterization studies, develop a plan, and then assist the trust with complying with the federal contract compliance issues, the FAR requirements. That's the Federal Acquisition Regulations. Then there's the site engineering, the annual planning. The annual planning is a very important part of the process, and that's where you engage the Tinker Air Force Base, the base civil engineer, the contracting officer, technical representative in the process, so that as you're developing and prioritizing the capital improvements for the next year, they're at the table with you. They've bought in with the process you're using to prioritize improvements for health and safety, for environmental issues, for reliability, and so forth. That way, when you present the plan, your annual plan to the government at the end of the year, there's no surprises. And when the DLA folks call back to Tinker, they say, yeah, that's what we need, that's what's most important, that's where the high priorities are, and so forth. So you try to develop this and foster a teamwork spirit out there, and I've seen it work very successfully before. And then the last one on there is managing the design, construction, startup, and commissioning of the capital improvements. Finally, we'll hire specialized contractors to do TV inspection and other services, maybe plumbers to help with some of the work on the service lines and so forth. So that's how we're going to minimize full-time staffing. So I think I'll just summarize now the overall features and benefits of this program to the City of Oklahoma City. The proposals contain protective language and a process to complete the needed due diligence to minimize the risk to the trust. Cost of service principles will be used to adjust forward pricing through an annual redetermination process. New staffing has been minimized using capital upgrades, consultant support, and specialty services. The community benefits by providing long-term utility service to sustain a key employer and an economic engine for the region. And then local consultants and contractors benefit by performing the design and construction of the capital improvements. So if there's any additional questions, that's...
Any questions? None. Thank you. Do we need executive session?
Yes, we would like to enter an executive session, so please, the trustees.
So moved. Motion and a second for exec. We'll go to executive session at the end of the agenda. Do we need executive session on the? We do not.
No, sir, thank you.
When we strike that.
Move to strike. Second.
Items from trustees. General manager report.
Just one that includes lake levels, new customers, and rainfall. As you know, it was a drier than normal January. The lakes are at a lower status than they were at the same time this year, but we're glad to see that Lake Draper is up a couple of feet, while Lake Hefner is down about 6 feet, as is Lake Overholser. We're moving toward the potential for a change in conservation levels, although we have been at the same overall lake volume for several months now, meaning that perhaps that we won't reach that level this spring. New customers are down a little bit, 14% compared to last year, which was a record year. Interestingly, again, new development plans are still on the shelves, coming in and waiting at about the same rate as last year, which again was also a record year for us. Finally, of interest is that in January, the volume of water that we produced was about 100 million gallons lower than the 1.6 billion, to 1/16th less than it was last year at this time. With the low growth, we will in 6 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, bring you a report about where we are on winter use rates, contrasting those with times prior to the conservation program.
What are the meteorologists forecasting for the spring? Below average rainfall?
Actually, so far, it remains an average rainfall, but as you know, we have very dry conditions, so we expect less runoff than would be normal.
Okay.
There's been quite a bit of discussion recently about how low Overholser and Hefner are in relation to the possibility that it would trigger the first round of conservation. You commented on that a little bit. Can you elaborate on that, about what we think will happen? That's the question I get most often, about when is that going to happen?
Sure. We're at 51.56% today, I think, the combined of all the lakes, and that's an available capacity. It's about 10% lower than the total capacity of the lakes. The water we can treat, we're at 51.56%. At 50%, we would look at implementing 2-day-a-week outdoor watering. We're working today on how to implement recommendations to you about how to implement that, recognizing your concern about being constructive in going forward with something that doesn't wishy-wash back and forth and confuse customers about the conservation level. So we're looking at options for that. And again, this time of year, I think it's unlikely that we'll hit 50%, but it certainly can happen. So we're preparing.
Any other questions? We'll go to executive session and be back.
I move that we adopt the resolution.
Second.